Joining us now is Andrés Rozental. He is the co-editor of a new book called Canada Among Nations, 2011-2012, Canada and Mexico's Unfinished Agenda. He's a former Deputy Foreign Minister of Mexico as well. And we're happy to welcome you back to TVO.
Well, thank you,
Been a long time. How you doing?
It's a pleasure to be back.
Good. Let's talk about this relationship between Canada and Mexico. You say it's a relationship that has increased in importance for both countries over the past couple of decades. How so?
Well, it's increased on the economic side. Ever since we signed and began NAFTA, we've had an important increase in trade and investment relationship between the two countries and with the U.S. as well. But it's also increased in other ways. It's increased in the number of Canadians who come to Mexico. It's increased in the number of Canadian companies that are operating in Mexico and that have investments, over 2,500 companies. And it's increased also in terms of the cooperation that we are in the midst of undertaking in terms of some of the security problems that Mexico's involved with.
Let me pick up on that, because you've said in the book that Mexico has now entered the ranks of our strategic allies, which sounds like a big deal. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you know, a strategic ally is someone that you are going to look at because things that happen in that country affect you. And I think that we believe that Canada, because you're part of North America, because of the number of Canadians who come down to Mexico every year, over 1.6 million Canadians last year, 2011, it behooves Canada to be very clearly involved with what goes on in Mexico, and vice versa. I think for us, because of the number of Canadian investors, because of the number of Canadians who come down, Mexicans who come here, although we are fewer now because of the visa requirement, but we'll get into that later if you want. Yep. The fact is that we now have a strategic relationship, which we didn't have in the past.
Well, let me get the... See that elephant over there? Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Okay, 1.6 million visits to Mexico by Canadians every year, and I'm sure most of them are quite wonderful, but the small handful that are terrible really do capture the headlines. Right. Murders and crimes and muggings, and it really is very scary. What's going on? Well,
I think, you know, if you look at the larger picture, if you look at the 1.6 million that go down, the fact is that the number of Canadians who get involved in one way or another in an unfortunate way, and whether it's because they're victims of crime or because they're perpetrators of crime, and that's always the case, tend to dominate the headlines because that's what the media want. I mean, this is what
sells papers.
It sells papers. So I think that the percentage of Canadians that are in Mexico at any given time that are victims or perpetrators is very small. The same with Americans. We have 15 million Americans who come to Mexico every year, and the numbers are minuscule. So, you know, I realize that the media makes a big issue out of it, but I don't think it is a big issue in the terms of the larger picture.
If a Canadian goes to Mexico, vacations, and gets murdered, that tends to, at the very least, have people have conversations in this country saying, geez, do we want to go there for our vacation, right?
Well, but it does, but you know that the number of tourists, Canadian tourists to Mexico has increased every single year up until now. We haven't had any effect, although I would suspect that people think about it twice if they're going to a place where something may have happened. Right. Most Canadians go to the beach. Most Canadians go to Cancun or Puerto Vallarta, none of which have had any problems with violence of the type that you will see in other parts of the country.
Okay, let's get a few more facts on the table here. 2010, Mexico was Canada's third largest trading partner, $27 billion in total bilateral merchandise trade. That's trailing only the U.S. and China. It was the first year also that trade with Mexico exceeded trade with the U.K., and that trend is continuing. Canada's trade with Mexico didn't suffer as much as trade with the U.S. and the U.K. during the financial crisis. Add it all up, what do we infer from that?
Well, basically that both Canada and Mexico escaped most of the effects of the global financial crisis, while as the U.S. didn't. So the U.S. consumer that buys things that we make in Mexico or that you make here in Canada affected the bilateral trading relationship between the U.S. and Canada and Mexico and the U.S., but not between Mexico and Canada. We have a robust economic growth. We didn't have any banking problems. We didn't have any subprime lending problems. So by and large, Canadian consumers and Mexican consumers and Mexican manufacturers and Canadian manufacturers are happy with the relationship, and there hasn't been a downturn the way that there has been in our relationship with the U.S.
Okay, we know tourism, obviously, but beyond that, what do you buy from us?
Well, we buy from you all sorts of things. You know, North America is now an extremely integrated economic space. We produce things that are made, parts of which are made in all three countries. So we buy parts for the aerospace industry that we have developed in Mexico. For the automotive industry, we buy auto parts. We have an enormous investment by the automotive sector of Canada in Mexico. We sell cars from Mexico to the US, to Canada, to Europe, to Asia.
It's all integrated now.
It's very integrated. And this is happening more and more in not only in the automotive sector, but in other parts of the economy. So we buy lots of things. We buy finished goods, we buy semi-finished goods, and we buy raw materials.
Let me ask you about energy, because of course Pemex is huge in Mexico, and you know, Canada is starting to assert itself as an energy superpower in the world. Many links there?
Not as many as we would like. I think that, you know, when and if the energy sector in Mexico opens up and Pemex doesn't continue to have a monopoly as it does today
in law,
in the Constitution, even worse than in law, because laws could be changed, constitutions are difficult to change. Yeah. But the fact is that Pemex has a monopoly. So Canadian energy interests in Mexico are limited to certain things like pipelines and contractual relationships with Pemex for exploration and other things. But no direct investment, neither from Canada nor from any other country.
When we talk foreign policy in Canada, we're almost always first and foremost talking about with the United States, then maybe a little broader, we think about NATO. We don't think Mexico. Do we have similar foreign policy interests, Canada and Mexico, that are starting to assert themselves more on the world stage?
I think so. Whether it's in the UN or in the G20, where we are both participants, or at the OAS in the hemispheric domain, I think we have interests which we share and on which we could collaborate much more than we do. Both countries have to be led to move closer together. That's one of the purposes of this book, which is to prove and to show that there is an unfinished agenda in the Canada-Mexico relationship and that we want it to go further.
Who needs to finish the agenda?
Both of us.
Who?
Well, governments, not the private sector. Private sector works very nicely. They take advantage of the comparative advantages they have, and they do very well. We have Mexican entrepreneurs in Canada, we have Canadians in Mexico. So it's not a private sector issue, it's a government issue, it's a politician's issue.
Meaning our Prime Minister and your Prime Minister and President don't get along that well, or what?
No, it's not a question of whether they personally get along, it's a question of whether the political will can be expressed to say, we both have individually an important relationship with the US, but that does not mean that we can't have an important relationship between ourselves.
Does the fact, though, that the US is, to use your word there, between our two countries, does that pose a bit of an obstacle in some respects?
It certainly does. I think it poses a greater obstacle here in Canada because you have a feeling that you have a very special relationship with the United States and that you may not want to contaminate it with some of the issues that we have in Mexico with the United States. I've always thought that that's a false argument. I always thought that bilateralism and trilateralism are not mutually exclusive. We live in a common economic space. We've had 17 years of the North American Free Trade Agreement. We have multiplied our economic ties, our investment ties by tenfold, and I don't think that that is necessarily exclusive of a closer bilateral relationship between Canada and Mexico.
Okay, having said that, we've done programs here on the fact that some people think that we ought not even to be in NAFTA with Mexico anymore. That with tens of thousands of people dying in drug wars, and never mind that there might be 1.5 million Canadians going down there and having a good time on the beaches, that Mexico is a different country than Canada and then the United States, and we probably ought not to be in that kind of tripartite alliance. What do you say to that?
Well, of course I don't agree with it. The violence that we're going through in Mexico and the problem that we're having with the drug cartels and organized crime is very much a function of the demand for drugs in the United States, in Mexico, and in Canada. Canada is a drug-consuming country, and it's also a drug-producing country. Methamphetamines, marijuana. When California was going to legalize marijuana, November 2010, BC got very worried because that's a big business in BC to sell marijuana to the Americans. I think this is a global issue, but it certainly is a trilateral issue. It's certainly one that affects all three of our countries. And I think it's extremely important, and this is where the strategic alliance comes in, for Canada not to look at this as a moment to get Mexico away from it, but rather to bring Mexico closer, to help Mexico in training for law enforcement, in training for rule of law, in helping Mexico deal with an issue that is not a Mexican issue per se.
And yet, as you want us to get closer together, a few years ago, our government decided that Mexicans needed a visa to come to Canada. How was that taken down there?
Badly. Badly because we are partners, we are strategic allies in de facto, and I think that people thought in Mexico that this wasn't a very friendly thing to do.
Slap in the face?
Yes, I think so, and a useless one, because at the end of the day, this was a measure that was taken to deal with a very small number of people who were being attracted by organized, I would say, crime, because this is a criminal activity.
To bring refugees
to smuggle people into Canada, to teach them how to become refugees in Canada and abuse Canada's very liberal asylum laws. Now, what they did was they put a visa requirement on, at that time we had about 500,000 Mexicans coming here as tourists. That's dropped 30%. People don't feel that they want to go through the visa application requirement.
That hurts them, but do you think it hurts us too?
I think it certainly hurts Air Canada, it certainly hurts the hotel business, it certainly hurts the tourism business, and they've said so in no uncertain words. I mean, there's a great deal of lobbying here in Canada to get the government to do something about changing that situation.
Let's talk security. In a post-9/11 security apparatus, in that world in which we now live, do you think that has contributed to pushing Canada and Mexico further apart as well?
No, I think that we have a common necessity, a common requirement to work with the Americans on ensuring that North America is a secure environment. The U.S. looks at this very much from a national point of view, so they close off the borders, they thicken our borders, our land borders. And we, on our side, should be pushing them to understand, and Canada has done something recently on this, that it is much more important to secure the North American homeland than it is to secure the U.S. homeland by itself.
Truth be told, though, they're more worried about your border than our border.
Yes and no. I think our border has always been a fairly secure border because it's a very supervised border. Very, very highly enforced border because of the illegal, undocumented people coming across.
If that's true, why is every Republican running for office talking about building fences and all this kind of stuff?
Because it's politics. I mean, you know, politicians will say anything. I mean, Mr. Obama, when he was campaigning, said, I want to reopen NAFTA, I want to get rid of it.
Right.
He did. He did. It doesn't make sense. And to be honest with you, I think all this Republican nonsense about building fences and moats and filling them with crocodiles, and you know, one of them even said we want to electrify it so they all fry as they're trying to cross. This is base politics. And whoever is president come November in the United States will understand that this is not something which is going to happen. So We have a secure border. We negotiated a smart border agreement, as did Canada. But I think the effect on Mexico was much smaller than it was on Canada, because the Canadian-U.S. border before 9/11 was an open border. I mean, there were parts where you could cross without even having somebody look at you. While as with Mexico, that's never been the case. So I think Canada has suffered more from the thickening of the border, and that's why it's become an important foreign policy issue in the bilateral agenda with the U.S., and why you've negotiated now not only the smart border agreement, but the perimeter agreement and so on.
I want to ask you one last question, and I want to ask about you. Because you and I have talked about this before, but for people who missed our last interview, and you'll forgive the way I put this, you don't look Mexican, you don't sound Mexican, your last name is not Mexican. I mean, it's Rozental, which hardly sounds very Mexican. What's your story, Minister?
Well, my story is the same, I think, as many Canadians. I'm a first-generation Mexican. My parents came before the Second World War to Mexico. My father was hired by a Mexican company. He was a chemical engineer. He was hired by a Mexican company out of Belgium, where he was finishing his PhD, and he moved to Mexico. And my mother was also studying. He brought her over. I was born. So I have a foreign-sounding name, very much like Alex Bugaliskas, who is my co-editor of the book, and many other Canadians. And of course, I'm of European descent, so I'm not dark-skinned. I'm not a mestizo, as many Mexicans are, a mixture of Indian and Spanish blood. And I studied in the States, so I speak English. But I speak Spanish as well, so if you want to do the rest of the interview in Spanish, I'm happy to do it.
¿Se habla español?
Por supuesto.
Okay.
Por supuesto.
Señor, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure, and I hope to see you again soon.
You shall. Good to have you here again.
Great.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.